Hello, I'm Adam,
I'm Adrian.
and welcome to Cast from the Crypt. Today, we're going back to a classic, 1998's Ring or Ringu,
Yeah.
the original Japanese movie that The Ring, which came out in 2002, is based on. The Ring is like hugely famous here. It's very a big staple of that early 2000s film, and it was kind of like a western introduction into the this sort of genre of Japanese horror, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yes. As was The Grudge. Both of them they fulfilled a similar role and came at a time when directors were adapting J horror for Hollywood audiences. And I'm glad that the movies had such an impact that we got to see those big budget Hollywood adaptations, but there is something about the actual source material, isn't there? Well, I shouldn't call it the source material, but the original films, because these films are, of course, based off of novels.
It's also something I did not know until watching this movie and
Yeah,
learning
yeah.
about it. Yeah. So this movie for me, I don't know about for you, but it made me feel very nostalgic. I don't know. It's just something about like this time and this type of horror that like feels really like what was happening in my childhood, I guess.
Yeah.
And just like the setting too, like the seeing the old technology and like even the old fashion and the hairstyles and everything kind of it brought me back a little. I mean, I don't know. It was weird to feel
Yes.
nostalgic about a foreign film I've never seen, but here I am.
No, but you're right. It does have that. I mean, it feels very 2000s. It really, really does. Or I suppose, you know, late 90s, early 2000s, the phones, the TVs, the fact that a lot of the horror revolves around the use of a VHS tape, right? Even like just the film grain, or I guess that graininess that comes with shooting a CRT TV from far away. There's a lot here that I agree. It feels very nostalgic despite being very Japanese.
Well, it's very of the time. Another thing that's super of the time that kind of resonated with me was the whole concept of like this urban legend horror movie that was very 90s, early 2000s. Like Candyman, this movie, and even like I Know What You Did Last Summer have this urban legend kind of monster. Like it begins as like this word of mouth thing school children tell each other, and then it ends up being real. Oh, if you say Candyman in the mirror, he actually will come. Like that's the
Yeah.
horror, and that's super. It feels that really is of this time period. I don't know.
Yeah, it really is. It's funny because early 2000s horror, there is a lot of schlocky, bad stuff that came out in, the 2000s, between 2000 and 2010. I mean, I can name way more garbage than I can, actually decent movies. I will say, though, I think The Grudge, the American Grudge, is far worse than its Japanese original. The Ring is really, really, I think, quite decent as far as early 2000s horror goes. And I agree. I think that the creature in that movie, I believe her name is Samara, but the horror that comes with her and just her existence is unique. You don't really see this kind of supernatural-esque horror being made anymore. And there was a decent amount of that going on in the early 2000s. I think some of that's thanks to Japan, and I guess it was also whatever was in the water at the time, because I don't know, maybe it was the advent of like the internet and digital media that made people more fascinated with supernatural elements and how they creep into our everyday lives, our everyday things. But I did make that observation that It's very, very unique. You don't see a lot of this stuff anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do have to agree with you that the remake is pretty good. All right. I am largely against American remakes of foreign films. I
Hmm.
think every English/American remake of a foreign film, it's such a dumb idea. Like, simply because you don't want to read a subtitle, they've made a whole new movie. It's just a weird thing to do. It's a weird phenomenon. Usually the remake is not as good because it's just a copy, of something original. Like Let the Right One In. Lots of these movies, I'm kind of against that, The Grudge. But this movie, I can understand why they made a remake for an American audience because there's a lot of cultural disparity, and I think even a language disparity that was kind of noticeable to me. And so I think an American remake/adaptation would make it easier for audiences in the West to resonate with the story and kind of connect with what's happening. Like, for one example, they have this saying that I forget exactly what it is, but it's something like goblins in the brine, something, something, something.
Yeah.
Um, that that felt like there was a big. It's a saying, but it also makes no sense to me. Anytime there's like a foreign saying or proverb or whatever, it's going to be kind of hard to translate. And I really question if goblin is an accurate translation of whatever they were trying to say. So there does feel like there are these kind of disparities here and there, and I can understand why it would be easier to remake this, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. That being said, I prefer this movie, and I'm glad you agreed to watch it because this movie, Ringu, largely popularized J horror internationally. It created a boom. Of course, was the catalyst for many, many Western remakes, as we've discussed. And I actually quite like this movie. I think it's really different than most of the Western horror that we get in many ways. Its pacing, its narrative. I think most people that haven't seen this movie would think it's a jump scare laden piece of garbage, and it really isn't. Though Sadako, the main antagonist, is very scary and is very incredibly spooky and unsettling. There's nuance there because her story is very tragic, and they use her so sparingly, don't they? It's different. This movie is very different in its style of horror.
Yeah, that is something I liked more about this movie than the American remake. Is she is used so sparingly. We aren't even introduced to her as a character or even an idea until pretty late into the movie. And in the American version, we get like these tapes of her while they're experimenting on her. We see her a lot, you know. And in this movie, she's this just figure in this tape. Not even is just one figure in this tape, kind of in the background,
Right.
and it makes her feel less material, less real, and much more like this ethereal entity. At the end of the movie, one of the main characters, Ryuji, says, "What if her father wasn't the doctor? What if her father was something not human?" And I love that mysterious, mystical aspect. Like, she is like maybe a spirit, like literally a spirit, not even a ghost, just like this otherworldly creature that you can't understand. And
Yeah.
I like that a lot better than just, oh, she's a creepy girl.
Well, and it lends itself to a lot of speculation, and that's proven right by the sheer amount of sequels that have come out to this movie. In the last 3 days, I've watched the core trilogy because there's Ringu, Ringu 2, Ringu Zero Birthday, which is like the origin story for Sadako. One of them, I should say. And then there is a forgotten sequel that came out called Spiral that was released in tandem with this movie. And it did so poorly that they scrapped it and they retconned it. And that's why there's actually a Ringu 2. And then that movie, Spiral, was later like repicked up, revitalized, and has its own string of sequels that are in that canon. In that way, that does feel very Western because we've done that with like Halloween and and a myriad of other movies that we have up here or over here. But there's also like crossover movies that have come out between Sadako and the girl from Ju-on or The Grudge, right? There's like a Freddy versus Jason type thing. I think there's two or three of those. So this has spawned a pretty lucrative franchise, from what I can tell. And I can't believe I've only really ever heard of this first movie. I'm really glad Tubi, I'm really glad Tubi has like all of them on there for free because it's helped me discover, this very prolific franchise.
Yeah, I was looking on there too. That this is a huge franchise. I'll probably watch some more in the future. I do feel like having seen the American version, I did have a little bit of familiarity with the story because it is a pretty faithful remake.
Yes, it is.
But the biggest changes are kind of stylistic and atmospheric, I guess. Like the way the story unfolds in this movie is a little less on the nose, is a little bit more ambiguous, and I like that more. 2002, early 2000s, when they're making these blockbuster horror movies in the West, especially a movie like The Ring that has been successful overseas and something that they knew would be successful while they were making it. Those movies kind of pander to a wide audience, but they kind of treat the audience a little dumber than maybe this original movie did. And I guess that is just because they think the story has to be clear so everybody can watch it, so it can be huge and blow up and make all this money. But this movie feels less like it's trying to make money. Of course it is, it's a movie, but it feels less of a cash grab, I guess.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's because Hollywood is Hollywood, right? There isn't quite a force like it in the world. It runs off of money. Its chief motivator is money, and that's why we very much have the quote Hollywood cash grabs. I'm curious if it's different in other industries. This is distributed by Toho, produced by a different production company, but distributed by Toho, who of course makes massive blockbusters and is very, very popular internationally. But I don't know. I agree. It feels, I don't know, like it's held close. I don't know how else to say that. It doesn't have this mass market appeal very clearly when you're watching it.
It's not our mass market, at least, if it is a mass market.
Right, right.
The two main characters are Riko Asakawa and Ryuji Takeyama. And I recognize the guy that played Ryuji immediately because he is a huge actor. He both in Japan and in the West. Most recently, he was Scorpion in the HBO Mortal Kombat movie that came out a few years ago.
Yeah, he was also in. I just saw him in Bullet Train.
Yeah, he's in Bullet Train too. I saw. I haven't seen that movie.
It was surprisingly good, but
okay, well maybe
he's in it.
Okay, yeah, he's huge, but I don't think he was that big when this movie came out, and I think this movie definitely boosted his career. It's one of the things he's more known for. So on one hand, it feels mass market because there's this huge big name actor in it, but on the other hand, he wasn't as big of a name back then. So
no, and I mean, I think to come out of the Japanese market and then to be in so many Hollywood films, most recently, like he was in Avengers 2, or as well, I should say. He also landed a spot on Westworld when I was watching that show. He was on it. So I think that's really cool. Right? It's rare you watch a foreign film and recognize many of the actors.
Oh yeah, definitely. A young Hiroyuki Sanada. I don't know if I said that, but that's his name.
Yes.
And that was kind of, in his prime when he's kind of a heartthrob. And in this movie, he's kind of this, like, I don't know, he's pretty sexy, isn't he, I guess? Or he's supposed to be in this movie.
Yeah, no, he certainly has an allure, doesn't he? And they hint at the fact that he's divorced. He and his wife are no longer together. They share a young son, and it is not said explicitly, but heavily implied that he is no longer, really interested in being with her. He is instead like hooking up with one of his university students because now he's a professor.
Yeah, and that's another, like, the sexy professor who's young
Right.
and hooks up with his students. It's pretty sensational.
Yeah, yeah. And what I like about this movie is it's not glorified in any way. It's treated as a taboo that may or may not even be happening, right? It makes you beg the question. It's not until the second movie that they do confirm that's what was happening, but this movie, the first Ringu, does not. And I really enjoyed that. It made these characters complicated. This marriage, or I guess, this ex marriage is very, very dead. You get the sense that there is no going back to their old relationship, Ryuji and Reiko. How did you say it?
Reiko Asakawa.
Okay. That's how I'm gonna say it. Ryuji and Reiko. But there's also, and I don't know if you felt this, but it was one of my favorite parts of the movie. There is this just kind of innate platonic love for each other that's present throughout the movie. Like they're bound by this traumatic thing that they're going through, and they're bound by their former relationship, right? The fact that they have this son together. He's moved on. She maybe has not completely, but they are still incredibly close knit and very traditional in their treatment of each other, which I loved. It made the actual events of the movie all the more heavy for me.
Oh yeah, Ryuji seems
Yeah,
kind of cold, a little crass, but this history and that they have together kind of ups the tension a little, and makes the situation a little more dire. And then, of course, at a certain point in the movie, they're trying to save each other, sure, but then their son ends up watching the cursed tape, and now they're not only fighting to save themselves, save each other, but also their son. And so they're kind of forced to be unified again. But there's not even a hint of romance. You're right. It is completely platonic. And I like that. I think it would have been weird if they forced a romance between the two. And they could have easily done that. I feel like another movie would have done that. But I like the direction they went with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a good moment to just commend the performances in this movie. I know this is an episode about Ringu, the first one in this franchise, but having watched the other two, there is a notable decline in the quality of performances. This movie, I will say, I think the acting is really solid. There's not a single performance I don't believe. Even the kid, Yoichi, I believed everything happening on screen, and I want to commend it for that.
Yeah, definitely. Reiko Asakawa is our main character, and she's played by Nanako Matsushima. And then, of course, Ryuji by Hiroyuki Sanada.
You want to give a brief rundown of the plot?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, do you want to actually?
Yeah.
Okay, please.
So the movie's cold open sees two high schoolers named Tomoko and Masami, and they are, doing what kids do, discussing an urban legend, a spooky tale about a videotape that will kill its viewers 7 days after they actually watch the tape. This is where we find out that one of the girls, Tomoko, I believe, says that she actually watched a strange videotape with a group of friends and received a phone call that told her she has 7 days to live. It is after this that they receive a jump scary, phone call, a red herring though. It has nothing to do with the 7 days that she will eventually have to live. And then they leave. Masami goes to the restroom, but this is where Tomoko is left alone. The TV turns on by itself. We see that staticky image, and then we know that she is ultimately killed. She's found dead.
I love this opening. It's
Me too.
super 2000s, late
Yeah.
90s. It feels like the Scream opening. This is very much like there's a few young people, maybe they're high school students, and they're, trying to scare each other. They're being playful, and then suddenly the monster, the killer, shows up, and they actually get slaughtered, and then cue the movie. It's right off the bat, I was feeling nostalgic, kind of just because of the way it's set up. It's classic, if you will.
And I have to admit, like, I rolled my eyes at the first phone call, because she was just talking about how she received a phone call saying she has 7 days to live, and they get that false alarm call. I thought it was corny, but I will say when Masami leaves and Tomoko is left alone, it's pretty spooky what happens after that. Her death. This, of course, is the catalyst for the entire movie. Tomoko, the girl that is killed, has an aunt who is also a investigative journalist. This is Reiko Asakawa, and she is, of course, our main character of the film. The movie is very much an investigation, a mystery of sorts, in which Reiko uses her professional skills to uncover the story of this videotape. The girl that is in the videotape, Sadako, who we meet later on, and we also get this really, again, as we've already discussed, riveting story of a ex-husband and wife, their young son, kind of working through all the family shit that people have to work through, right? Paired with an incredibly traumatic and binding experience. It's dope. It's a really great setup.
Yeah, one thing I didn't like at first, but it kind of brought me around to, was it felt a little too convenient for me that Riko's niece was one of the victims while she was already investigating the story. But as the movie progressed, it's never explicitly stated or anything, but there does become this question of, like, is any of this coincidence? Maybe they were kind of fated. Maybe they were led to the actions they take or to the things that happen in this story. We learn that Sadako, who is the Samara of this movie, I don't know why they changed her name to Samara. That's kind of...
I have no idea. Yeah.
But whatever. Sadako has a extreme ESP and is super psychic, basically. And now that she's this otherworldly ghost / spirit, maybe she can influence events in the real world. Definitely. When Reiko first watches the tape, she just finds it in, like, the office at this inn, and it's unmarked. She has no reason to want to watch it, but she does, and there's no real good reason why, except maybe she was influenced. And then she shows it to Ryuji, and pretty much right after they see it, they realize something's wrong with it. They actually start getting visions and just these bad feelings, It feels like suddenly they are linked to this sort of spiritual phenomenon that's happening. And that is something I really liked about this movie, is the main characters aren't dumb. Like,
No, they're
how
not.
many other horror movies have the dumbest main characters? Stuff, like, pretty much day one of the 7 days, they're like, oh, this tape is haunted. They accept it. They realize they're gonna die, and they start working to prevent that. And I like that they didn't meander and drag the movie on with, oh, well, maybe it's just an urban legend or whatever. Like, no, they're having visions, and they pretty immediately are like, okay, this is real.
Well, that's what I'm saying, right? Like, Western horror from this period is marred with stupid characters, just really, really, I guess, ham-fisted interactions. Like, the way characters find themselves in the circumstances that, lead to their deaths tends to be very convenient. In American horror at the time, there was a lot of like random vulgarity and just general trashiness in the horror movies at the time. Like what comes to mind is the Hills Have Eyes reboot that came up around this, maybe like 2002, 2003. The Texas Chainsaw reboot that came around this time period. None of it was original. It all felt very derivative, and it was a lot of flash over actual substance. This movie uses its scares, its actual, I guess I should say, like show and tell scares, very sparingly. What's scary about this movie is the ambiance. What's scary about this movie is the fact that you care about these characters and they are doomed. They are going to die, and you're wondering if they can figure it out, right? But what's not present in this movie is the convenient, stupid moment, the random, vulgar villain for no reason, which I just really enjoy. It's rare to find such a refreshing movie that isn't new, right?
Yeah.
Like, it felt like a breath of fresh air, and it's from 98.
Yeah. And that was a pretty, like you were saying, unoriginal time. But yeah, the horror derives from not what is happening, but what will happen if they don't figure this out in time. So there's this tension permanently over them. And then every day passes, they like show what day of the week it is, and then, this is the second day or this is the third day or whatever. And I like that. I like when they put a timer on something. It's tense without needing to have, scary jump scare every 10 seconds. Another thing I was really impressed with this movie, maybe the thing I appreciated the most, was the sound design in this movie. So much of the scary parts of this movie aren't a crescendoing, high-pitched note like you might see in other horror movies, but it's, I don't know, this echoey, resonant sound, I guess, if that makes sense. And that might make us like draw an association later with when we find out Sadako is a corpse lying at the bottom of this well. Maybe that makes a little more sense, but it's very, very spooky. It's hard to describe sounds, but really well done sound design, I think.
No, I agree. The general ambiance of this movie is really effective.
Oh, yes.
This is weird. I don't know if you're going to relate to this at all, but it feels kind of cozy, but also really horrifying. I really don't know how else to say that.
Okay.
Maybe it's just the context in which I watched it.
Maybe. I don't know.
But there's something about it that just feels like a blanket movie. I don't know. But yeah, the well is, of course, incredibly famous. It is for me, that and her crawling out of the TV are the two images that come to mind when thinking about this movie, and were the two images that came to mind when thinking about this movie even before I watched the original Japanese one, because it's also present in the American remake. I think it had to be, just because it's so classic. But the well is, of course, also integral to the conclusion of this film.
Yeah. Another thing, I'm gonna just keep saying things I like about this movie, but the movie walks this very fine line between existing in the real world and then being just like surrealist. Like all the horror, all the sort of visions that the characters see are not always explicitly just a vision of something that happens or vision of the past, but it's kind of just like this surrealist imagery, this horrifying imagery, and they don't really know what it means. You don't really know what it means until the characters find out throughout the movie as the runtime progresses. And the tape itself that they watch is like the ultimate example of this. It makes no sense. It's scary and it's just cryptic. Yeah. And so this cryptic surrealist imagery and horror and ideas are what drive these characters to like figure out what it means before they get killed.
That's where I think this movie really succeeds in a way that its sequels don't. The the cryptic nature of the movie is a part of the actual terror that comes with it. Later on, both sequels that I've seen, apparently there's a 2019 sequel that I have not seen yet, but they try to explain the different elements seen in the tape. And I mean, that's cool, but we can both agree. I think narratively, it's so much scarier when you have no idea where these images are coming from, and you're trying to piece it together with the protagonists. Getting answers is comfortable, but continuously asking these questions and watching the clock tick down is, I think, where the real enjoyment of this movie comes from.
Yeah. I don't know. How do you feel about Sadako's look?
I like it. I mean, I think I think nowadays it's tough to really compare it to anything that we're getting now, but it in the 90s, I'm sure it was fresh and different. I know that my entire childhood I was horrified of the image of the girl with the hair over her face with the pale skin. My sister used to like put hair over her face and walk into the living room to scare me on purpose. I had never seen this movie, but the association of that image with something scary. Maybe I had seen a movie trailer or something at the time. It was enough for me to be truly scared. So Sadako is a classic character. I think her design is classic. I think today, sure, it's probably a little tired, and I think that visual horror has to evolve a little bit more for today's audiences. But at the time, I don't think you can refute how impactful it's been.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One thing everybody's always afraid of like creepy girl with the hair in front of her face. Like that's kind of what people think about when they think of this design. But for me, she had these fingers where the nails had been like scratched and pulled out of her fingers, and so they were just like bloody holes where there used to be fingernails. That disturbed me the most. I have like I guess like a thing about fingernails. Like they freak me out in a tactile way, and that was sending me over the edge when we were watching this. But yeah, it is a pretty iconic image, and like The Grudge is more or less this same image, but this is the genesis. This is the original design of this sort of monster. And you could argue though that it comes from like older Japanese sort of influences. Like there's a lot of like mythology and folk horror of a monster that looks like a woman with long hair, and so this feels like the modern successor to that sort of idea and that kind of monster.
How'd you feel about the finale of this movie?
Well, I seeing the American remake, I kind of knew loosely what would happen. I guess I'll spoil it. They find out the only way to stop the tape from killing you is to make a copy of it and show it to somebody else. And I kind of liked it because it full circle brings us back to the idea that this is an urban legend. Like every urban legend, it's supposed to spread from person to person, just like, mouth to mouth. And it's normally, we think of it as like a harmless kind of fun thing. But in this movie, it's very real and it's very deadly. And you have to keep the legend alive if you want to survive. And I think that's fun.
Yeah, I also like that. It's the sequels explore Sadako's story and just how horribly mistreated she was. And for me, before having seen those movies, it did feel like an interesting premise that she has to have her story told in order for you to avoid that awful fate. It feels very unique, and I really enjoy it. I think that the last moments of this movie, where Reiko and Ryuji are running out of time, and they've actively investigated this girl and her story, and they are beneath a cabin crawl space that's just like
littered with cobwebs and mud, and they are receiving visions that are basically uncovering Sadako's story, showing that she was bludgeoned by her father, her own father, and then pushed to the bottom of this well, where he then trapped her inside. So the two characters, in a moment of compassion, but also just trying to see if they can break this curse, uh, uncover this well, suspend themselves into it, all while their time is running out. And after they drain the water from the well, they find her skeletal remains. And there's this like really long, lingering shot of Reiko holding the remains in her arms as though she's like giving these bones a hug. And they believe that they've broken the curse for good. Now, Reiko earlier in the film makes a copy of the tape and shows it to her husband. So her curse, we learn, was broken long ago, long before she has this really final moment with Sadako's remains. But Ryuji's fate is still sealed because he never showed his copy to anybody else. And I love the contrast of that really beautiful moment where Reiko, this mother, this compassionate human being, is holding Sadako's remains, giving them a hug because this girl's existence was so sad and so traumatic. But that juxtaposed with the really cold and nihilistic ending of Ryuji dying anyway because he didn't hold up his end of the deal. I found it to be really gut-wrenching and also just incredibly satisfying.
It's just like this girl was turned into an urban monster. Her whole existence was covered up. Initially, the characters think that the ghost haunting them was her mother, Tomoko Oishi, but it ends up being her, that nobody even knew she existed. Her birth was covered up, her life was covered up, and her death was covered up. And so it's like this person who, in the public eye, never existed, has become this urban legend that does exist, you know? It's this thing people don't think is real, but it really is. It secretly is. I like that. I like this story. It makes sense. Another thing I like about this that you don't really get in the American version is there's this kind of theme of like mysticism, maybe like Japanese mysticism. The characters are almost superstitious when it comes to this curse. Like they keep describing it as a curse. They're not being haunted, they've been cursed by this tape. It is a cursed tape. They talk about how Sadako's mother was a bit of a pariah because she had these psychic powers and she used to talk to the ocean and was supposedly like bad luck. You know, there's these ideas of bad luck. And then at the end, when Ryuji says maybe the doctor wasn't Sadako's father, maybe her father wasn't human, you know, there's all this like, ooh, this mystical aspect to this story, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, I found myself really, really enjoying this franchise. Like I'm really grateful to have discovered it, and I'm really grateful that it's free because I kind of can't believe it's been here all this time and I had no idea. Especially given the fact that I don't know if you can agree with this or not, but like for me growing up, I was always very aware of this character. And I was always very aware of like the imagery associated with this movie. It's classic, truly classic. The well, the girl climbing out of the well, the TV, the static from the television, the hair over the face. But there is a riveting narrative at its core. And I don't know, I really hope people watch these movies. I really hope that they don't just let it go into the folder of like niche horror reference.
Yeah, maybe that's why it was so nostalgic for me, is because growing up I did see this character everywhere. I saw it referenced a lot. But it is more than just this character and this image of a girl crawling out of a TV. Like you said, there is a story in this movie. It's not just a throwaway, whatever, woo-woo horror movie where there's a cool monster. Like, there's more than just a cool monster here. And I'm glad I watched it. And I'll probably watch at least a couple of the sequels. I don't have as much faith that they'll be half this good, but that's kind of the nature of a horror movie franchise. I'm on board with the first one, and so I'm willing to be on board with the others, I guess.
I like them. I'm not sure, where they fall in order to me, but I've been enjoying them, so I'm excited to see what you think.
Yeah, I did enjoy it. I'm glad you recommended it to me. I'm always happy to have like a new franchise to get into.
Me too. Yeah.
It's always great. It's kind of hard to find a worthwhile franchise to watch a couple entries of, but I'm glad there's one more in my back pocket. Man.
Evil Bong is Evil Bong 1 through 17 or however many of them there are.
There's like 9, I think. Yeah, I'm not going to recommend that one. I'll say watch the Ring franchise first. The worst Ring movie is better than the best Evil Bong movie.
Hot take.
I don't think it is.
No, probably not. But yeah, thank you for watching it.
Yeah.
I appreciate you giving it a shot.
Well, thank you for talking about it with me.
Yep. Thank you, buddy.
All right. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Goodbye.